Good morning and welcome to Lakeshore Community Fellowship. I'm Pastor Josiah, and I'm so glad you've joined me this morning as we're continuing in our series going through the book of James on practical Christian living. Now, I've spoken with many Christians in my life, and I'm sure you have too as you've gone through this Christian journey as you've been involved in church. And one thing I've found unique in almost all of those, hear stories of conversion and people coming to Christ and starting this new journey of a relationship with Him. One thing I found similar in all of them is people expected it to be different. They expected that then when they became a Christian, their problems would go away, that they wouldn't have hardships anymore, that they wouldn't have suffering anymore. Now, some of you more experienced Christians may look at that and you might smirk because you know the reality. Even though we have a relationship with Jesus and that brings great joy to our lives, we still go through great suffering as Christians. We still go through loss. We still suffer. We still have hardships. Our physical experience on earth can often get worse as a result of being a Christian. It doesn't necessarily get better in a physical sense. As Christians, we still experience great suffering, great loss. And James, at the beginning of his letter, to the Jewish believers, brought up trials and hardship. And now we're reaching the end of the book of James. James is again bringing up this topic of suffering. Now, James is a really short book. It's 5 chapters. You could probably read through the book of James in, under 10 minutes, or maybe 15 minutes if you're, an average reader. And why he brings it up twice in such a short book is because of its incredible relevance in your life as a believer. Suffering and trials get a lot of room in this small letter, and so we need to pay attention to its importance in our lives. All the way back in July when we looked at James 1 and we looked at trials, we looked at how we can triumph over our trials. The things that come in our life, and they might be temporary, and how we can triumph over them. But today we're looking at a different aspect of suffering. And we're looking at suffering and trials from a different perspective that James brings up. We're not going to be looking at temporary trials. We all experience hard things in our life that are temporary. You might go through a job loss. We're in COVID-19 and many people are finding themselves laid off or out of work. And it's terrible. That is real suffering. It's hardship. But it's temporary. Right now you're going through it, but you're going to come out of it. You're going to get a job or get your job back someday. We are going to be looking at the type of suffering that doesn't go away. We're going to be looking at the type of suffering that stays with you. Loss, grief, divorce, the type of hurt that stay with you the rest of your life, that don't go away. These are scars that stick with us. And these are often things that as believers we are ill-equipped to deal with. We're not good at dealing with them. They don't go away. We can't ignore them. And often why we are ill-equipped as Christians to deal with these lasting pains, this lasting suffering or grief, is because we don't expect it to happen to us. Maybe intellectually we understand that we're still going to go through hardships in life, but often we can have a works-based paradigm where we think, we follow Jesus, we're living good lives, we go to church, we try to help people, and when terrible things happen to us, we're often asking why. Why me? Why why did that happen to such a good person? An old U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, I think, said it best, how we can often feel during suffering. Theodore Roosevelt's mother and his wife died on the same day. And he wrote in his diary, "The light of my life has gone out." When we suffer, I think we can often feel that way. When you go through tremendous grief, when you go through the loss of a loved one, when you go through a divorce, you can often feel the light in your life start to dim. Where there's no end to this. This is not temporary. This is the rest of your life, and the light of your life can start to dim. So what are we to do in our suffering? What are we to do in the midst of that? And I believe James gives us an answer to it. And in fact, James writes on how we can be patient in the midst of suffering. So how can we do it? How is it possible to be patient, to be blessed, to be hopeful in the midst of lasting suffering? Please join me in James 5:7-11 as we get an answer. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. James is writing to these Christian believers who were facing suffering. Christians for all periods and all times have faced suffering and hardship. And we too face hardships. And it's not just unique to Christians either. It's just a natural part of being a human in a fallen earth is we face tremendous suffering. We all face hardships. We all face persecution, scars of abuse, grief, loss. But often as Christians, we don't expect it to happen to us. We're following Jesus. We have this new life. We're going to be living with Jesus forever in heaven. And yet we still deal with suffering and pain and hardship on this earth, despite our relationship with Jesus. We can often think that these things shouldn't happen to us, but they do. In our suffering, I believe, a few different things can happen inside of us. When we're not expecting suffering and it happens, this is often what can happen to us. And first, we become impatient. And I believe why James in verse 7, tells us to be patient is because of exactly what suffering brings, which is a lack of patience. We can impatiently want our suffering to end. Who wouldn't want their suffering to end? We can be impatient that God's not going to do anything about our situation. We can be hopeless and think, we're going to be in this forever, that God doesn't care about me, that he's forgotten about me, that I'm going to have to deal with this all on my own. Second, we can become angry in our suffering. In verse 9, James warns us not to grumble against each other. And the word grumble doesn't really give justice to what James is trying to say there. It's not just complaining against each other. It's taking the grief, frustration, pain that's inside you from your suffering and putting it up against another person, taking it out on them. In our own pain, we can often lash out on those nearest to us, or we can lash out at those we believe who are having it better than us. Often in our suffering, we can look at others who aren't going through what we're going through, and we can get bitter. We can get angry. Why am I going through this hurt? Why am I going through this pain? And that person's not. Don't I deserve a better life? And lastly, in verse 9, we see that in our suffering, we can often become judge and jury of the world. And James in verse 9 reminds us that God's the judge. And why he does that is, I believe, in the midst of suffering, we can often become judge and jury of the world. We can claim to have answers. And later in this text, James brings up the story of Job. But in the story of Job, one of the things that happen is at the end of Job's frustration, he finally lashes out and acts like he has the answers. He's judge and jury over the whole world. We might not say this outright, but in our suffering, we can often think or subconsciously act like if we were in charge instead of God, we would be doing a better job. We can act that way. If we were in charge, we would have a better plan. We can often blame God in our suffering like he doesn't care about us. So what are we to do in our suffering? What are we to do instead of these things, instead of being impatient, instead of being angry, instead of becoming judge and jury of the world? What are we to do in our suffering to have what James calls us to have, to be patient, to persevere, to be blessed? And James, I believe, gives us the first part of the answer in verse 9 where he says this: "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. And the first thing James does, and I believe we need to do to be patient in our suffering, is James points us to that there is an end to our suffering. And that's the problem we can face in the midst of suffering, is we don't see an end to it. We don't see a way out. We feel like we're drowning in it. But James points us to the fact that there is an end to your suffering. It comes with the second coming of Jesus Christ. Remember, the Christians in James's day would have had at least a second-hand account of the life of Jesus. And in fact, many of them were probably eyewitnesses or knew people who knew Jesus when he was alive. Many of them were alive the same time as Jesus. So Jesus was reality to them. He was not a historical figure. And they firmly believed that he was coming back in their lifetime. In fact, I think all of them, the disciples included, would have been shocked to know that it's been 2,000 years and Jesus hasn't come back yet. I'm going to give you a few examples of just how firmly they believed that Jesus was coming back, and it could be any moment. In Hebrews 9:28 it reads, "So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him." In Titus 2:13, "Waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ." He was their blessed hope. They're waiting on him to come back. 1 Thessalonians 5:2, "For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." And in fact, Jesus himself talked about this, how he's going to come back like a thief in the night. No one's going to know the day. Now, why this is so important is because the Christians back then, and we need to be like this as well, were firmly looking and hoping for Jesus to come back. They believed like it could be any day, and they lived like it could be any day. They lived like he could come back at any time. That was what their eyes were focused on. That was what their hope was in. Now, the reality for many of us is I don't believe we live like Jesus is coming back any day. We look back over 2,000 years, and I'm sure most of us assume we probably have a few years at least. He's probably not coming tomorrow. But this mindset does not allow us to be patient in the midst of suffering. And why that is because the second coming of Jesus means the end of your suffering. And so we need to live like Jesus is coming back any day. We need to live in that reality because first, it's true. He could come back any day. He could come tomorrow. He could come tonight. He could come at any time. So we need to live in that reality. And second, you being able to be patient in your suffering is dependent on you living in the reality of Jesus coming back. Now, the word most commonly used to refer to Jesus' coming back is parousia. It's used typically of the invasion of a country by an army, and specifically it's used of the visit of a king or a governor to a province of an empire. So when this word is used of Jesus, it means that the second coming is the final invasion of earth by heaven, and the coming of the king to receive the final submission and adoration of his subjects. The second coming of Jesus is the arrival of the king. It's God appearing to his people and mounting his eternal throne. It's God directing on the world the full blaze of his heavenly glory. Why we can be patient in our suffering is because we know our suffering has an end, and that end is coming with Jesus. An analogy is given in verse 7 to explain this a bit more to us about the farmer waiting for autumn and spring rains. The meaning of this is that the farmer cannot do anything to speed up those rains. Maybe you grew up on a farm and you're dependent on the weather, and nothing you can do can bring about the weather you desire. You have to wait for it. You have to be patient, and it will come. He has to wait. The farmer has to wait. And there's no doubt that the rain will come. There's no point in him being angry or stressing because the rains are going to come. They came last year, they're coming this year, and they're going to come next year. In the same way, Jesus is coming back. It's a reality. He is coming back. Just like the farmer is waiting on the spring rains, we too are waiting on the coming of Jesus. We don't know when it's going to come. We can't speed it up. But he is coming. It's a reality. The disciples believed and lived that way, and so should we. Why looking to the coming of Jesus allows us to be patient in our suffering is because of what the coming of Jesus will bring. In Acts 3:29 it reads, "Until the time comes for God to restore everything as he promised long ago through his holy prophets." The coming of the King, the coming of Jesus Christ represents the restoration of all things. Of all things. And we see that in Hebrews 9:29, jumping back to the verse I read before. The first time Christ came, he was offered for the sins of many. But he's coming again, not to deal with sin. He already dealt with sin completely on the cross. And those of us who believe in him will be raised with him. But Jesus is coming back to restore all things. He's coming back, and that's it. That's the end of our suffering. He's going to restore everything. And I want to focus on this word restore. It can often be a Christian word we use, but you might not know the meaning of it. And I want to use an analogy to help you understand. Imagine an old, rusty car that an experienced mechanic takes in. He works on it. He cleans it. He takes out all the parts that are broken and fixes it. And then puts on a fresh paint job, and now it's shiny and working great. It's a nice classic car. In the same way, though we are saved from sin, those of us who are in Jesus Christ, we still deal with the reality of living in a fallen, broken world, in a fallen, broken body. We still age, we still die, we still get sick. We still experience the sufferings of this world. We're not saved from that yet. That part is not done. We are waiting on Jesus to come again, to save us from that. Jesus is coming not just to restore this world, but to restore you. The reason why we still have suffering, pain, grief, loss is because all is not done yet. Jesus is coming back, and he's going to fix it. He's going to restore it. And why we have to fix our eyes on the second coming of Jesus is that's the end of our suffering. And that's the beginning of all new things. When we're restored, when we live with Jesus forever in paradise, when all of the things we lost in this world, they're not truly lost. All the good things we will have back. It'll be the greatest celebration ever. It'll be the coming together of all things new, where we get to live with Jesus forever. No more pain, no more suffering, no more grief. That is what we have to look forward to with the coming of Jesus, and that's why our eyes need to be set so firmly on that reality, that he could come any day, because it puts into perspective the things of this life. It allows us to live free of the things of this world. If we truly believe Jesus is coming tomorrow, we're able to be free of the things that can so often chain us down in this world. But second, it allows us to live with hope, because we see that the suffering of this world, it's temporary. It's not going to last. It's coming to a firm end. But now you might be thinking, okay, I admit that there is an end to my sin. We have that. But what allows us to live patiently with our sin today? What allows us to live with our sin today? We do have our eyes set on Jesus. We have the hope that our suffering will come to an end. But how can I deal with it today? How can I live patiently with my suffering today? And I believe James gives us an answer to that further down in the text. Let's read verses 10 and 11. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord has finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. James is showing us two things in this text that allow us to persevere in suffering in the now. And there are two words here that are key to this whole text. And no surprise, it's persevere and it's suffering. The word persevere means to remain under the load. Imagine you're under a heavy weight. A heavy weight is on top of you and you're underneath it. You're bearing the load of that weight. That's what suffering can feel like often. You're bearing the load of that weight. But the word here in this case means something a bit unique in the Christian sense. It means to remain under the load uniquely by God's power. That's what it means. It's not just human strength. You're not just, a stronger person than anyone else. It means to persevere, to stand beneath the burden of suffering by God's power. By God's power. In the midst of suffering, when we so often feel alone, we have to remember that God is sustaining us. He is with us in it. He is holding us up. Even if we can't see him, he is holding us up in the midst of that suffering. There's a famous Christian poem written by Carolyn Carty, which I think clearly illustrates this bearing the load by God's sustaining. I'm going to summarize the poem rather than reading the whole thing. But there's a man who has a dream about his whole life and all the suffering he went through in his life. He sees two sets of footprints on the beach, his own footprints and God's footprints beside him, walking on the beach, representing his life journey. And at certain moments he sees, when he went through the most hardship in life, he sees one set of footprints disappear. And throughout the difficult times in his life, he only sees one set of footprints. And he thinks to himself, during those most difficult times in my life, I was alone. God was not walking with me. And God responds to him and says, my son, during those times where you saw one set of footprints, the most difficult times in your life, I was carrying you. God was carrying him. That's why there's only one set of footprints. And in the same way, in our suffering, we can so often feel alone. I'm sure you felt this and I felt this, where you feel like God has abandoned you, like you're walking alone. But we have to remember that God is with you, sustaining you. And God sustained the prophets and all those who believed before us. When Elijah fled from those wanting to kill him, God was the small voice in the cave with him. When Noah and his family were in the ark surrounded by high waves, God was keeping them safe. God was protecting them. When David was on the run from King Saul, when King Saul wanting to kill him, God was keeping David safe. In the same way, when King David was surrounded by enemy armies, God was with him. God is with you, just like God has been with his people. He is with you, sustaining you, even if you can't see it. If your eyes were truly opened, you would see an army of angels around you, protecting you, keeping you safe. God is with you, sustaining you. And next, we see that Jesus transforms our view of suffering. The two things that allow us to persevere in the suffering right now is first, knowing that God sustains us in suffering, like we just looked at. But the second thing is knowing and seeing that Jesus transforms our view of suffering. In verse 11, it reads this, as you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The word suffering in this context comes from the Greek word kakopothia, which means to experience affliction that seems bad. It's miserable. It seems bad from an earthly perspective, but in actuality, it's sent by God to accomplish his greater purpose in you. I'm going to say that again. The word means, the word suffering here means something that seems bad in an earthly perspective, but in actuality, it's sent by God to accomplish his greater eternal purpose. And what James is doing is he's transforming our view of suffering with Jesus Christ. Look, he points us to Job, the example of Job. Job lost everything, to summarize his story, his wealth, his family, his home, his health. He lost it all. It was all taken by him. And on the surface, all is miserable. He's lost it all. Everything you can imagine you could lose, he lost it. But in reality, God was working to accomplish something great in all of it. Everything Job lost, God gave it back and more. And God used Job's story for all Christians, all believers of all time to look back to as an example. The good things that Job thought were lost forever, his health, his family, and his home, they weren't gone. It was given back and more. God brought about his plan through Job's suffering. Why we can trust God, why we can trust his good plans and purposes, and why they will be accomplished through us through our suffering, is because we know firsthand through Jesus Christ that the greatest evil that ever happened on this earth brought about the greatest good. When you're going through your dark places, when terrible things are happening to you, when you're suffering, when you're grieving, and you don't see how anything good could come out of it, you don't see how on earth God is working through it, you can trust that God's bringing his purpose through it, because through the greatest evil, which was the execution of Jesus Christ, the God-man who was crucified on the cross by his own people, through that greatest evil, the greatest good was brought about, our salvation. That when Jesus rose, we were risen with him who believed in him. When Jesus was executed in Mark 15, literally the light of the world went out. Darkness covered the land. It was the darkest moment in history. But out of that evil, God brought about the greatest good, which was our salvation, who would believe in Jesus Christ. If God brought about the greatest good through the greatest evil, think about what he can bring out of your darkness. Think about what he can bring out of your suffering. That doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily see a silver lining in your life. There are many things in this life that you will see no silver lining, but someday you will. When you stand before God, when you see what he sees, when you know what he knows, you will see that he did things exactly as he should have. You would never doubt him. You would never think that he made the wrong move. It means that we can know assuredly that someday we will see his plan and we will praise him for what we did. If we could see what God sees, if we could see what he's working on, what he's bringing into place, we would never question his actions. We would never question what he allows to happen in our lives because we would see the greater purpose. Why you can be patient and blessed in the midst of your suffering is because through Jesus, you see there is a purpose to your suffering and there is an end to your suffering. And more than that, you stand with a family of believers. For thousands of years, all believers of God, all believers of Jesus have suffered. Almost all of the disciples suffered and were executed. Our Savior, Jesus, was executed but risen again. Most of the prophets suffered tremendously, yet God sustained them. God had a purpose through them, through their suffering, and through the greatest suffering of his Son, Jesus Christ, he brought about the greatest good, our salvation. Just think about the good he is bringing through you, and be patient in your suffering, looking to the Lord's coming. Thank you for listening.